Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine Carney, and I work with the Iowa Agriculture Literacy Foundation. One of the projects that I get to help manage is Read Across Iowa, which encourages the love of reading and learning about an important part of Iowa's economy, agriculture. This video is a recording of a live event with Michael Caduto, author of Riparia's River. Within the program, Michael reads Riparia's River and teaches us about buffer strips, and he even leads us in a song. As you watch the program, we want you to picture the earth and keep in mind how it's round, because we are all a part of the earth and can impact each other. Michael also has a hidden call and response throughout the video. When Michael says ho, yell hey to let him know you're still with him. How many call and responses can you find? Now, enjoy the program.
It was a sultry summer day, the kind that would make a frog sweat, if it could. Gretchen and her twin brother, Jason, led their young sister and Jason's best friend, Mark, along the riverbank to their favorite swimming hole. "I'll race you to the rope swing," Jason shouted to Mark. They took off along the narrow path, trying to pass each other and be the first to reach the rope on the huge oak tree that branched out above the water. "I beat you," said Jason as he swung over the deep pool in the bend of the river. At the farthest reach of the rope, Jason let go and dropped into the water. The instant his head came up, Mark landed a perfect cannonball beside him. When Mark surfaced, Jason was coughing and pushing aside some slime. "What's wrong with this water?" he said. "It smells like a sewer." "Wow, you're not kidding. And what's this?" Mark asked, lifting up his hand covered with green stuff. Both boys scrambled out of the river. Gretchen caught up with them, sniffing the air, and she said, "What did you two do in the water?" "Very funny," Jason said. Their younger sister, Daphne, trundled up the trail. "You never wait for me," she said. "Well, we're all here now," said Gretchen, "but I'm not going to swim in that." "Me neither," said Daphne, holding her nose. "Maybe if we go upriver, we can see what's going on," Gretchen said. "Why upriver?" asked Daphne. "Water flows downhill, so we need to look up the river to see where the slime is coming from." After walking for a while, Gretchen spotted someone else on the riverbank. A woman stood surrounded by the arching branches of an ancient tree. "Hello, are you looking for someone?" "Not exactly," said Gretchen. "I am Riparia," she said, smiling. Daphne repeated the name to herself in a slow whisper, which she always did with any big new word. "Riparia." "Yes," Riparia said briskly. "My name means of the riverbank." She looked at Mark and Jason. "I see you've been swimming. You shouldn't go in the river right now. The river isn't well." "Yeah," said Jason. "We kind of figured that out the hard way. Do you know what happened to the water?" "Come with me," said Riparia as she started to walk upriver. "I'll show you." At first, the children looked around, asking each other silently if they could follow Riparia. Then Jason ran after her and called, "Wait for us." Walking behind Riparia, the children saw that she moved as gracefully as a deer. Her feet touched the ground so gently that they hardly made a sound. The banks dipped down to the edge of a grove of river birches. Nearby, the passing water sang over the rocks and riffles. "See how the trees cast shade over the water?" said Riparia. Sure," said Mark. "That's what keeps the water cool. Trout and other kinds of fish and the insects they eat need cool, clean water." "Why?" asked Gretchen. "Cool water has more of the oxygen that fish breathe through their gills. The cooler, the better. Insects like it too. But the green stuff you found in your swimming hole uses up a lot of oxygen." "I don't see any insects," said Jason. No, you wouldn't see them unless you looked under the rocks, or if you came and looked at night when many insects crawl up onto the tops of rocks to feed. Riparia led them farther upstream. The lush tangle of riverside plants gave way to the edge of a cornfield, which went right down to the water. This is Amy's family farm, Gretchen said. Riparia pointed to the eroded riverbank. The farmer sprayed a weed killer on the cornfield, and when it rains, the chemicals run downhill and into the water. See how the dirt is washing away? But Amy's dad needs corn to feed his cows, Gretchen said. You're right, the farmer can plant his corn, just not all the way down to the water. How far down? Asked Mark. And Riparia asked, do you have a good throwing arm? Mark puffed up his chest, held up his arm, and said, look at that. You bet I do. If you stood at the edge of the water and threw a stone as far as you could into the cornfield, it would land about as close to the river as the farmer should plant in order to protect the water. She looked at Mark's bicep. That would be about 100 feet. That land between the water and the cornfield is called a buffer. The plants that grow naturally within the buffer keep the water clean. How? Asked Gretchen, crouching down to get a closer look. When rainwater runs down to the river, it carries topsoil and fertilizer and chemicals with it. Plants slow the water down so most of the topsoil settles out. Roots act like fingers that grip the soil and hold it in place. Plus, the leaf litter and roots absorb lots of chemicals and fertilizers. A buffer helps keep the runoff and clean it out the water before it reaches the river. Jason yawned, looking away. Is this where you were taking us? He said impatiently. Riparia shook her head and beckoned them on. This time, little Daphne was the first to follow, and the rest fell in behind her. At the edge of the next field, a barbed wire fence curved down into the river. Cows grazed there and wandered into the water to drink and cool off. The soil was muddy and pocked with hoof prints. Gretchen sniffed the air. That's the smell at the swimming hole, she said. Is it coming from those cow pies? Cow pies? Asked little Daphne. You know, cow poop. Yes, and that's not all, said Riparia. The manure and soil that wash into the river act like fertilizer, feeding the algae in the water. What's algae? Asked Mark. Tiny microscopic plants. There are millions of them in the river. When too much fertilizer gets into the water, the algae grow quickly. And that's how slime got into your swimming hole. The slime is algae fed by the cow manure and fertilizer from the cornfield. Then, when the plants die and decay, the oxygen gets used up in the river and all those bugs and trout can't live there, Gretchen said. Exactly, said Riparia. Plus, the decaying algae smells like rotten eggs. I'm friends with Amy's, the farmer's daughter, said Gretchen. We're going to have a little chat about this. Her dad's farm is hurting the river and ruining our swimming hole, said Jason. Careful, said Riparia cautiously. You don't want to upset your friend. No one likes to be told what to do. Well, then what can we do? Asked Jason. I can't sit here and watch our swimming hole go down the river. What if we invited Amy to come swim with us? Mark asked. Riparia smiled. Good idea. For a while, they all stood and watched the cows drinking and wading along the shore. When Gretchen turned to ask a question, Riparia was gone. Where did she go? They all looked around, and Riparia was nowhere to be seen. How did she do that? Asked Daphne, walking over to Gretchen and hugging her waist. That's awesome, said Jason. I want Riparia to teach me how to move like that. She's as quiet as a fox. It was even hotter the next day as Amy joined the group for a swim. When she saw them standing by the rope swing, she asked, "Why isn't anyone going in?" "Check it out," Jason said. Amy wrinkled her nose. "What's that smell?" "Come with us," said Gretchen, "and we'll show you." Gretchen led the group upstream to the cornfield and the cow pasture beyond. She explained how water runs off the farm fields and hurts the river. "I didn't realize so much stuff was washing into the water," Amy said. "It's really gross." "I can try," Amy said, looking down at the ground. "I can talk to my father, but he's really busy, and things aren't going too well with the farm. So I don't know what he'll say." She looked up at her friends, "But I'll try." The following day, everyone sat down under the big sugar maple behind the twins' house. No one spoke. They just stared at Amy. "My father says he doesn't have the time or money to deal with it." "So what are we going to do?" asked Mark. Amy said, "He also said if we could figure something out, it wouldn't cost him any money. We could fix the problem ourselves. He said it might keep us out of trouble." "Hey, I know," cried Mark. "If we do what Riparia says and move the fence back 100 feet and help things grow back along the riverbank, and the water would get clean again." "Riparia?" Amy asked. "A woman we met by the river. She told us something called a buffer can stretch out between the farm field and the river, and it would help keep the water clean," Gretchen said. Then she turned to Mark. "Doing all that work would take time, lots of time and lots of energy." "I've got time," said Mark. "I've got energy," Amy said. "Me too," said Daphne as she planted her little feet, folded her arms, and stuck out her chin. Jason looked over at her like he was about to laugh, but instead he said, "Me three," and put his arms around his fierce little sister. During the weeks that followed, the children worked. Amy's dad helped them remove the barbed wire from the fence posts. They set the posts back away from the river, then restrung the wire. When the fence was done, Mark and Jason slapped high fives. "Dad," said Amy, "there's one more thing." "I know, Amy, I know. Goodness knows you've asked enough times. Starting next spring, I'll only plant corn down to 100 feet from the river." Amy smiled. "Thanks, Dad." The next morning, the children started to move plants from other parts of the riverbank to their new buffer. At the end of the hot day of hard work, Amy said, "There's way too much work here for just the 5 of us. We need to get more of our friends to help." As the days passed and word spread, more and more people arrived to help. Gretchen told the helpers everything that Riparius said about why it was important to have plants growing along the riverbank, about all the good things that plants did for the water and for life in the river. Throughout that summer and the next, the children planted hundreds of nearby wildflowers and shrubs and trees between the river and the new fence line. They planted red maple and cottonwood, green ash, willow, and sycamore. Then they planted alder and blueberry, elderberry, groundnut, boneset, Joe pieweed, and lots of ferns. Daphne liked it best when they put on their bathing suits and old sneakers and mucked into the shallow mud to plant cattails and pickerel weed. Time passed. The plants grew. Seeds of other plants arrived, falling from feathers and fur of visiting birds and animals, and left behind in their droppings. Within 2 years, a beautiful stretch of wildness grew along the riverbank where the corn and muddy cow pasture used to be. One day, the children spotted monarch butterflies flitting among the milkweed blossoms, and they heard a pair of goldfinches flying past, singing a sweet song with each dip of their flight that sounded like they were saying, "Potato chip, potato chip, potato chip." Look at that, said Jason. The riverbank we planted has turned into a real home for these animals. A real, habitat, said Gretchen. Right, replied Jason. Riparia would be happy, Amy said. It looks like someone is, Daphne laughed as a monarch butterfly flitted by her nose. Last one in is a rotten egg, exclaimed Jason as he ran toward the riverbank, yelling, "Yee-haw!" And that's the end of the story. Oh,
Hey.
and then there's a picture and a list of all the birds and plants and fish and butterflies and mammals and dragonflies that are mentioned in the story.
Awesome. Should we see if anybody has questions?
Yes, definitely.
Have you ever made an audiobook?
We have some audiobooks that go with some books that I have called Keepers of the Earth, that series, but I have 2 storytelling CDs and a music CD. So yes, I've gotten into the studio and recorded some stories. Do you listen to audiobooks?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. They're a lot of fun. What's your name?
Taylor, how did you think of the book?
Well, the publisher I was working with wanted a book that was a story about things we could do to keep our waters clean. And so this is a story that I imagined when they asked me to write a book about that.
Cool. We had a question from Miss Mullins' class. They want to know, how many books have you written?
That's a good question. Technically, I mean, there's 2 ways to answer that. One is how many books of mine are published, and that would be somewhat over 20. If you include the teacher's guides, there's more. But then I have a lot of other books that I have written that are, some of them are done and some of them are book proposals that I'm looking for publishers for. So there's probably another equal number of about 20 other books that I'm hoping to get published at some point. I love writing, so I just write.
Okay, how about Miss Jardin's class?
Where were you originally born from?
I was originally born in the state of Rhode Island.
Oh.
Yeah.
And why did you start writing?
I started writing just because I think I love writing. When I was in 5th grade, we had an assignment about writing, and they wanted us to write about a story. So I wrote a story about someone getting marooned on a tropical island. And that, for some reason, when I wrote that story, I realized I loved writing. And then I had a really great 5th grade teacher. And so I was very lucky that I had teachers who really encouraged our students to write. Then I had a really wonderful teacher when I was in high school, who in my English class, and he was really great. So I've always loved writing, and I've been really lucky to have really good teachers. What's your name?
My
What is it?
name's Abigail.
Oh, hi.
Hi,
Hi.
Abigail. Let's go to Miss Anderson.
I'm Zadie, and my
Hi.
question is, how did you get the idea of this book and its characters?
And its characters.
Yeah.
So the book was something that I wanted to write a story that involved, I like to show that anybody can do something if they put their mind to it. When I was growing up, my mother used to always say, don't ever say the word can't. You can always do something if you put your mind to it and work hard. So I wanted to have a story about keeping the water clean that showed children from a lot of different cultures, and that would encourage everyone to think about what we do and how it affects the water, because the water is important to everybody, all the plants and animals. And so I started thinking of names and the characters. When I start writing, the characters just come into my mind almost like I didn't even try hard to get them in there. They just pop up in the story. Do you like to write?
Do you like to write?
Yeah, I do like to write.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So if you're maybe when you're writing, you've had that experience that you start a story and then it just starts happening in your imagination. And that's kind of how the story happened. I had an idea of what I wanted it to be. And once I started it, it just kind of creates itself in my own imagination.
Okay, let's do one more and then Michael's going to share some more information about barriers. Go ahead, Katie.
Right. Is there someone who proofreads your stories?
Yes, that's a very good question, because no matter who the writer is, everyone needs someone to proofread their stories. And so whenever I write a story and I'm working with a publisher, they have an editor who reads through the different drafts. And there's a couple different ways of editing. One is as you're creating the story, they read the story to look at it and think about how the story is working. And then once everything's working really well in the story, then another editor comes and looks at all the words and punctuation and does more making sure that everything's spelled right and the punctuation is right and all of those kinds of things. So there's really, with any book, there's a couple different people who do the editing and proofreading and that kind of thing. That's a really good question. Thank you.
Okay, Michael, if you want to go ahead with sharing the next part, and then we will come back to questions after Michael has shared for a little bit.
Okay, so this is a kind of a little slideshow. This is more of the science part. So we have the story. Excuse me, and this is the science that goes with it. So it's about the benefits and beauty of buffers, which a buffer, if you remember from the story, it's all the plants that the children planted between the fence and the water to protect the water. So riparian buffers, meaning buffers along the river, are important habitats or homes for plants and animals that also protect our rivers and streams. Plant roots, you can see those roots going along the riverbank are almost like fingers holding the soil in place. They keep the water clean by stabilizing the banks and preventing soil erosion. Buffers store floodwaters and slow the flow of rivers, preventing flooding downstream. So when a river gets high and the buffer is along the riverbank, the water goes out, spreads out into the buffer, and is stored there so that it doesn't rush down the river and flood. Water flowing through a buffer slows down, and all of the stuff in the water settles out along the riverbank, including pollution that's absorbed by bacteria and fungi in the leaf litter, meaning the things that cover the ground. So buffers help to clean the water. Wildlife depend on buffers for food and shelter and nesting sites, like this great blue heron, which is hunting, and you can tell because its eyes are looking straight ahead and it's looking at its food, or what's soon to be its food. And beavers live along buffers where they eat bark and then they cut trees down to make their dams. Some animals like this loon, they nest along the buffers, often more in lakes. And so it's very important. Buffers also help to keep the water from going too high or too low, and by moderating all the water that goes in and preventing flooding, which is important because if the water rose too high, you can see this loon's nest is right above the water. If the water gets too high, it can flood the nest and all the eggs would float away. So buffers help to prevent that in places. There are places where people love to go swimming. And they're a great place to go for learning and for doing service projects to help make nature more alive and healthy, to protect the water. So here's a group of people planting things on a buffer to help that buffer be a better protection for the river. Healthy riparian buffers shade the water and keep it cool for aquatic life like trout. And they're some of our most beautiful, pleasing natural areas. But a lot of buffers need care and maintenance to keep them healthy. So here's a cornfield on the right, and then a buffer that these two people are working to plant new plants, and then the river. So you can see the buffers between the cornfield and the river, just like in the story, protecting the water. So if you don't do anything to help your buffers, sometimes that doesn't work because the water can erode the riverbank, and then the plants growing there, like the field along this river, it just all falls into the river and all that soil washes downstream. And if you don't have good buffers, this is what the water looks like. It's all full of silt and soil that washes into the river. And this is an amazing photograph. Some years ago in northern New England, I live in Vermont, we had a huge storm called Tropical Storm Irene, and places where there were not good buffers, a lot of soil washed into the river. Now, this is a picture of where the Connecticut River that flows by where I live, and all the soil that went into that river all the way down for 300 miles until it got out to the ocean in Long Island Sound. So this is soil that's coming from northern New England down the Connecticut River out into the ocean, 300 miles it traveled. So good buffers help to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Along a riverbank, if people are walking there and playing there, if there isn't a good buffer, the soil gets pushed down and there's no place for the water to go into the side of the river, so it can make flooding downstream. If there's no buffers, then the stuff that gets in the river, the soil and fertilizers, they can make the water very rich, like fertilizing the water, and then it grows green slime, just like in the story. And those are blooms of algae causing the oxygen to drop, and that's not good for the insects and fish because it uses all up the oxygen that's there. So erosion happens when the plants are removed from the buffer. And the plants just can't grow either where the water's going up and down all the time. So one way to protect buffers is just to leave them alone if they're there and let nature do its job. And dead woody things like dead trees that fall in, they hold the bank in place and they make shade where trout can go in the cool waters along the riverbanks to find their food and stay cool and get lots of oxygen. Like this trout, this is a trout that was caught and measured for a study, but it didn't like being out of the water, so it tried to get back. And here's a buffer that's between two parking lots. And still there are things you can do, even in the middle of like a city or a suburb. You can plant plants like these two people are doing, and maybe they're planting dogwoods or some other plants, that shrubs that will grow and protect the water and keep the soil from washing in. That's what they're doing here. Surrounding each plant with a little piece of plastic so that it stays, the water will stay in the soil and keep the plant moist. And here's another buffer project. They're restoring a buffer along the edge of a cornfield. Planting dogwoods by putting them sticks in the ground with the root side down. A bunch of them are planted here on this place where it's eroding, and those dogwoods will grow and keep the soil from washing into the river. This is a happy buffer restorer right here. fun going out, being in nature and doing these kinds of things. Here are a bunch of trees that are planted along the edge of this buffer. And they put tubes around them so that the rabbits and mice and other animals don't chew on the trees, so they get to grow up and come to the top of those tubes. And they have to keep them watered. So it's a lot of work, but it's fun. And here's one that's already in 1 year, it's grown all the way up to the top of that tube. That's a little dogwood tree or shrub. So buffers help all the water that's going from the field into the river to be filtered and cleaned, prevent flooding. They're beautiful. All the plants that come in are good homes and habitats for birds and mammals and all kinds of animals. And they protect the water where things like turtles live and birds go, like this hummingbird. Oh,
Hey.
all right.
Okay. Does anyone have some questions about buffer zones? Or other questions for Michael?
All right, we have one.
Okay.
How do they form?
How do buffers form?
Yeah.
Well, if you leave the area alone and don't plow it or anything, then birds bring seeds in and they blow in on the wind and things will just grow naturally. But it's even faster to go and plant things so that they'll get rooted quickly and grow in a shorter time. So it can happen naturally, or you can plant and make it happen faster.
Isaac has a dad that farms along the Macocata River here.
Oh,
so
yeah. Great.
he's used to this, right?
What does he grow?
Corn and hay. And
Oh, okay.
soybeans.
Yep. Do you help him? That's great.
How about Miss Harris's class?
Have you ever been an illustrator before?
Have I ever been, I'm sorry, what, please?
An illustrator.
Oh, I do. I like working with art. I'm not a really good illustrator for children's books, but I have illustrated a couple of my books with like a pen and ink type of artwork. Yeah. Do you like to draw?
Yeah.
Oh, that's neat. What's your name?
Kylie.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Good question. Okay, how about Miss Brinkman's class?
Hi.
Hi.
What did you have to do to get all of the information?
Oh, good question. I do a lot of reading. I read articles and I read books, and now I do a lot of research online, and I take notes, and then I make an outline of all the information so that when I start writing, I have it in front of me and I can just kind of like use the information I need when I get to it. So it's a real plan, and that makes it easier to write. If you do your research and then have it all in front of you when you're writing, then you can just focus on the writing and all the information's right there. That's how I do it. Good question.
Yeah, let's do Miss Mullins' class and then Miss Klepper's class.
Have you ever farmed before?
Yes, I have. I actually started off wanting to farm, and I spent quite a bit of time working on a farm, and I started out studying agriculture at the University of Rhode Island. So I love farm work and being outside and doing that kind of work. So yes, how about you? Do you do some farming?
Yeah.
Yeah. What kinds of things do you grow?
Pigs and sometimes chickens.
Oh, okay. That's great. What's your
Thank
name?
you.
Calvin.
Hi, Calvin.
Okay, let's go to Miss Klepper's class.
Do you need a bigger buffer for how
In the water.
yeah, like how high the water is or how hard it's flowing or rushing?
That's a really good question. And the answer is it depends a little bit on the riverbank. Like if the riverbank's really steep, or if it's very gradual. And if it's steep, the water can't get out of the river very much. But if it's like not very steep, it can spread really far out, like one of the pictures I showed. So usually you need a buffer that's up to, the reason that story says 100 feet wide is that not just to protect the river, but so the animals have habitat to move up and down the river. So a lot of animals use buffers as a way, even in places like suburbs and near cities, to move around because there's not much natural areas for them to move in. So they're sort of like natural highways along the river for animals. The animals will move up and down. So the answer to your question is that it depends a little bit on the riverbank and how steep it is. But altogether, it's good to have one that's about 100 feet wide if you can.
That is awesome. So should we do a song?
Yeah, we have time for song?
Yeah, can we do a song really
Okay.
quick, everyone?
Yeah,
Not
absolutely.
me, Michael. He is a
So,
professional.
here
So
it is.
teachers, if you still have questions, go ahead and type them into the chat while Michael gets ready.
Well, as I said at the beginning of the program, the circle is very important. And so this is a song I wrote many years ago called Circles of Life. I wrote this song just before the Lion King movie came out, and that they have a different song with the same title in that movie. And this song has a chorus you can sing along to, so I'm going to teach you that chorus. It goes like this. Lift your hands in harmony. Make every day you live another song. Let's sing it together. Lift your hands in harmony. Make every day you live another song. And when we sing those words, let's imagine joining hands with all the plants and animals and people around the whole world in the big circle of life. So when we sing, lift your hands in harmony, let's raise our hands right up in the air, and we sing and have the hand motion at the